Luke, I start with you. You have reported this out from the moment it happened through the congressional probe into these acts, and specifically, one of the doors that was never unlocked by the 1-6 Select Committee was what was behind, what would come out of Mike Pence's mouth when asked questions like, what did he say to you? We only heard the words that were used. To the degree that we know it's the P word, one of Trump's favorites. It's because Ivanka shared that with her executive assistant. The 1-6 Select Committee was masterful in putting these pieces together, but we never heard from Pence himself. What does this ruling unlock?
Right. Well, it is a significant breakthrough. You know, if you talk to anybody on the January 6th committee that investigated this matter, you know, person number one is Donald Trump and person number two is Mike Pence, of all the people you want to get information from. And they never heard from either of those men in the end. Now, they did get a fair amount of information from some of Pence's top advisors. And we do know a fair bit about what happened between Donald Trump and Mike Pence, but we do not know everything. There are certain elements of certain conversations between Trump and Pence that have never been disclosed, but now may have to be. It appears from this judge's ruling, from what we're learning from this secretive process in court, that anything that has potential for criminality may have to be testified to by the former vice president. And we know that he has said that he believes President Trump put his life in danger and put his family's life in danger. We could hear a lot more about exactly what pressure was put on Pence. And we also do know that people involved in some of this pressure campaign with Mike Pence, specifically John Eastman, asked for a pardon afterwards, put it in writing that he thought he should be eligible for a pardon based on this pressure campaign that they had on the vice president. So they had some knowledge here that they had some legal exposure, potential criminality. And, yeah, I think this is a huge breakthrough and will really open up the Justice Department's investigation.
So, Joyce, I want to just start, and I want to focus where Luke has brought us on questions of criminality, because we know from the final sort of conclusions of the 1-6 Select Committee that there were 4 crimes specifically, and I've talked to Pat Hafey about this, that they specifically believe they amassed adequate evidence to make criminal referrals for. One was obstruction of an official proceeding. One was insurrection. One was fraud. And there's one that slips my mind with Trump. It's hard to keep track of all of the alleged criminality on his part. But I wonder if you can take us through, just start with obstruction of a criminal proceeding. What kind of questions would you ask Mike Pence in front of a grand jury if you were trying to prove that crime?
Sure. So I would have a lot of questions for Mike Pence, and call me old-fashioned, but I like my witnesses best under oath, especially witnesses who have avoided testifying for as long as Mike Pence has. So prosecutors will want to walk him through, I think, the entire course of conduct during the campaign to see if there's illegality during the campaign, if there's knowledge and an intent to challenge the election if he loses, and how early on that develops. You know, this evidence of obstruction, it's a broad theme across the Trump campaign, and Pence uniquely has conversations with Trump where no one else is present for both sides of them. So as we get into the specific sort of obstruction that involves the January 6th proceeding, Pence has always been a really essential witness. And of course, there's this notion of, was he threatened, or was there any effort to use inappropriate leverage with him to interfere with the outcome of the election? A lot of this comes down, and I should say that Judge Boasberg is known for being a very careful jurist. So we haven't seen the actual language in his order. We don't know how much latitude it gives Pence to try to duck questions. But there may well be litigation over specific questions as his testimony unfolds. And it's likely that while he will have to sit down and begin to answer, we haven't heard the last of court engagement in these proceedings.
So I like that Joyce led us somewhere very specific, Charlie Sykes. So was he threatened, and was there intent? Let me just start with what Donald Trump said on stages in public starting around January 4th through January 6th.
And I hope Mike Pence comes through for us, I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president comes through for us. He's a great guy. Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much. I hope Mike is going to do the right thing. I hope so. I hope so. Because if Mike Pence does the right thing, we win the election. And we're going to have to fight much harder. And Mike Pence is going to have to come through for us. And if he doesn't, that will be a sad day for our country.
And all we are demanding of Vice President Pence is this afternoon at 1 o'clock, he let the legislatures of the state look into this so we get to the bottom of it and the American people know whether we have control of the direction of our government or not.
The intent was abundantly clear to everyone with eyes and ears, Charlie Sykes.
Yeah, I mean, let's break this down. There are the legal issues, there are the political considerations, and then there are the moral obligations or the obligations of somebody who is a public servant and a citizen of the United States who is sworn to uphold the Constitution. And I can't speak to all of the legal issues, but just take a step back. If you actually have evidence of the attempt by the President of the United States to subvert the Constitution of the United States, to obstruct an official proceeding, to incite an insurrection, what do you need to actually sit down and testify about that under oath? Isn't that one of the fundamental obligations that if you have direct knowledge of a crime against the United States of America, isn't it something that should be incumbent upon you to come forward? And this is the big disappointment of Mike Pence, that he keeps hiding behind these strained legal arguments. And of course, you have people who are saying how politically unwise it would be for him to testify voluntarily. But at some point, you do have to put, I don't know that if some people might think it's corny, but you have to put your obligation to the Constitution and the country before all of those legal and political questions. And that's what really faces Mike Pence, that if he was in the room and he has direct knowledge of an illegal attempt to overthrow this election, if he has direct knowledge of an attempt by the President of the United States to aid and abet sedition, then, whether you're thinking about right now or his place in history, doesn't he have an overriding obligation to testify to that under oath?
Well, Charlie, of course he does. And only former Republicans suffering the PTSD of watching their own party align itself with the country's domestic violent extremist movement would couch it in this sort of defensive language of it may sound corny. Of course. Of course we're talking about duty. Of course we're talking about patriotism. And of course those words are hard to put it in a lot of sentences about Mike Pence, right? He had that one moment on January 6th for which we're all grateful. But that's just how pathetically low the bar is when you're talking about Republicans, especially Republicans in Trump's orbit. And again, I want to root all this in the facts as we know them, as Luke reported them on that day, as they've been developed by the 1-6 Select Committee. Here's what those words I just played from Trump and Eastman, that was the cause, this was the effect. Here are the rioters.
I am very concerned about Mike Pence. I have no idea what he's going to do. Did not love the way the president talked about that.
Pence lied to us. He's a total treasonous pig. And his name will be mud forever. Now the real battle begins.
Bring out Pence! Bring out Pence! Bring out Pence!
And I want to play one more piece of sound because we have Trump's words. We have what the rioters heard and plan to do. And here's the testimony, sworn testimony, presented by the 1-6 Select Committee of what the reaction was and what happens after all that from Mike Pence's Secret Service detail.
Last entry in this page is service the Capitol does not sound good right now.
Correct.
What does that mean?
The members of the VP detail at this time were starting to fear for their own lives. There was a lot of yelling, a lot of very personal calls over the radio. So it was disturbing. I don't like talking about it, but there were calls to say goodbye to family members, so on and so forth. It was getting, for whatever the reason was on the ground, the VP detail thought that this was about to get very ugly.
So, Charlie, you talked about Mike Pence's duty to the country. How about his duty to the men and women who already testified before Congress, to the men and women who had the job of running him, not walking him? I traveled with the president for 6 years. I never ran anywhere. Maybe we should have, but I never ran anywhere. Running him down the stairs of the U.S. Capitol and making those calls as testified to by a witness by the 1-6 Select Committee to say goodbye to family members. What obligation does Pence have to them?
That alone should be enough. The obligation of the men and women who laid their lives on the line and feared for their lives that day. His obligation to his own family, which feared for their safety. All of that is true. And also remember that, what's happened since all of this, that you have, Donald Trump, when he sat down with Jonathan Karl, and Jonathan Karl asked him, what do you think about the hang Mike Pence chance? And Trump basically said, well, they were really mad. That he seemed to be comfortable with it. And then just over the weekend, you have Donald Trump standing down in Waco with his hand over his heart while they played an anthem from some of these seditionists who attacked the Capitol, who attacked these police officers. You have the president, the former president, continually reminding us that these were his people, that he incited it, he justified it, and now he is embracing it. And I'm hoping that the special counsel is keeping track of all of these comments that the president is making that reaffirm the fact that he was okay with what his supporters did, that he was okay with the attack, that he was okay with the threats against Mike Pence, which clearly were inspired by his words and his actions.